Mike Pompeo joining us now on the broadcast. I think this is a very important time to have Secretary Pompeo join us because of this being the first major overseas trip by President Biden. These serious issues that could be addressed and should be addressed while he's overseas. Overshadowed a bit in the beginning, maybe by what's happened with his vice president. But things are, again, there's certainly issues at the border. The new numbers are horrendous. But I do want to focus on, because Mike Pompeo is a former Secretary of State, the importance of these meetings going on as we look through the schedule for President Biden. He spoke to our troops, and then today meeting with Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So my first question, Secretary Pompeo, is how critical is this first trip for presidents? I mean, you're there as CIA Director, then as Secretary of State. So just the glimpses that we see out of these meetings, which is usually through press conference or joint statements. But how important are these behind the scenes, what's happening, and also what we see publicly?
So, Jordan, very important. These countries are taking the measure of a new president. Many of these leaders would actually know President Biden. They would have known him from his time in the Senate, but they're now getting to see him as America's commander-in-chief and the individual that can deliver American greatness to support them. And so they're trying to figure out precisely what he's thinking. I think his speech, you talked about him meeting with the military yesterday, I think his speech was a signal to these leaders. He said at that gathering, he said that the risk from climate change is the greatest threat that faces the United States of America. And so everyone in Europe, I promise you, heard that, and they will take that to heart. Sadly, I think they're prepared to let the American economy suffer, the American worker suffer, to work to reduce carbon. And they're not about to do it to themselves. They're not going to destroy their economies on the altar of the Green New Deal. But I think they heard that loud and clear. I hope what they see from President Biden as he moves through his days of visits is they see the resolve, the deterrence model that the Trump administration put in place. But sadly, I fear that they're going to see American weakness, and instead of America first, they're going to put the Green New Deal first, and that makes each one of us a little less safe.
I mean, every time he's writing, he's putting anything out. He put an op-ed out in the Washington Post, and he talks about any of the other issues. Talks about the harmful issues called harmful activities of governments of China and Russia. He's of course going to be meeting with Russian President Putin. That'll be kind of the last part of this trip next week. But it's, and then even COVID. COVID's there, but climate. It is climate. I mean, and his quote was that he was told by his Joint Chiefs of Staff that that's the number one issue. National security issue is that global warming is that, and it's, again, I'd say, Secretary Pompeo, regardless of where you are on that issue, that doesn't really seem to be the military's number one function or role, or any function or role that they would play. But then second, because I think what you said is important. It's this administration signaling to the world what they want the world to bring to the table, basically, which is all climate.
That's exactly right. By the way, I know most of those members of the Joint Chiefs. I would be shocked if any of those members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually said that in the way that President Biden described it. I know what they're worried about. They're worried about the threat from the Chinese Communist Party, and not the threat from the potential increase in temperature across the next decades that are in front of us. They take that seriously. They want to make sure we deal with that as well. But the threat that they work on and focus on every day is the proper role for the military, and that, of course, is to make sure we're secure from the threats abroad, the real military threats that other nations pose to us. May I say one more thing? I will tell you something else they're very worried about. The military is also always worried about what you were all talking about before, 180,000 folks coming into our country. They know that the risk at that kind of scale, that a terrorist is able to get here inside of the United States, that someone who comes here with true malign intent, not just these folks who are trying to find a better life for themselves, but are committing crimes and conducting sex trafficking and moving drugs all throughout all 50 states. I promise you our senior security leaders all across government are watching that with absolute horror to see the change that has taken place over just now 4 months.
I would say, the numbers are just staggering. I mean, you look at February when it really started moving up, got into the six figures at 100,000, and then it has sustained 170,000 plus, reaching 180,000 of people that were encountered. That is the people that had an encounter with a U.S. government official, whether it's Border Patrol, ICE, someone like that. We don't know exactly what that means after you have an encounter, and we also that does not include an estimate of how many people made it through without having an encounter. But Wes, I know you've got a question as well.
Yeah. I think, Mr. Secretary, the threats we face are multifaceted. There is not one threat, perhaps, that's larger than another, but all of them together pose some pretty ominous threats for us. But if you were trying to describe to those young sailors and soldiers and airmen in Europe what the biggest threat we face as a military, I'm just curious as to how you would describe it and how you would put that in words. What is the biggest threat we face?
I always remind people, and I would remind those soldiers too, that the biggest threat we face to our republic comes from inside the United States. We've got to get things right at home in our schools. We've got to get America right from how we think about being American. We can't allow people to divide us by race or by culture, all of those things. We are Americans. Those soldiers and sailors and airmen that were sitting there in front of President Biden are great Americans no matter what their background is. And I would remind them of the importance of the fact that they work for the United States Army, not a factional divided group of Americans. Second, I would tell them that we've done a lot of great work on counterterrorism over the last 20 years. Important work. Our military has done a great job of keeping America safe. But today, the threats that we face are from great powers, and they are different in kind. We've seen it with the cyber attacks that have happened on America. We've seen it with respect to efforts to undermine us with information, and now with a virus that came from China. We need to make sure that we have a full-scale, broad capacity to defend America. And those soldiers, those young people that were sitting in front of President Biden are the very people who can help deliver that security over the next 10 and 20 years.
Than.
Mr. Secretary, Than Bennett here. I wanted to follow up on your answer about the threats. I really feel like the looming threats of Iran and China and even Hamas maybe loom over this whole trip. I appreciate the fact that the president says that one of the main purposes of the trip is to express solidarity with allies. But I just don't know how you can do that when you're pursuing a renewed deal with Iran, given the current posture in China, and then even the emboldening of Hamas. How does he pull that off? How does he convince allies that they are indeed the focus, given the posture he has in other places of the world?
You know, it's interesting because we talk about Europe as a singular. That's a great question. We talk about Europe as a singular entity. With respect to Germany and France, and often the United Kingdom on those issues, on Iran and China, they're frankly closer to where President Biden is than where the Trump administration was. We wanted to impose enormous costs on the Iranian regime and stay out of a nuclear deal that was going to put Americans at risk. Those countries are all putting pressure and have been putting pressure on the United States to rejoin that fatally flawed deal. So they'll find kindred spirit in President Biden on that issue. But other Europeans understand that Iranian assassination campaigns, Iranian terror, the attacks on Israel from Hamas funded by Iran, that those are things that are bad for them. And so you'll see a split even inside of Europe and how they respond to President Biden's posture with respect to both Iran and to China.